As mentioned in the previous video, our home page is going to have many of these carousels. And in order to implement the many carousels, we are going to make use of the code that we wrote for this one. So basically, we are going to be reusing that code. We are not going to write the entire code for the other carousels individually. So the code we wrote for this one, we will use for all the carousels that will be available on this page. Right, so if you want to increase the number of carousels on this page, and you simply copy the carousel section, let me just copy from start to finish, and then you paste that carousel section on the page, and then you go and refresh the page. Of course, it's going to appear, the carousel is going to appear quite alright, but when you want to use the carousel, it's going to behave in a very funny way, because you'll be clicking on one and the other one will be working. So it's going to be broken on so many levels, and the reason for that is simple. We are instantiating a carousel that has a class of post slider, but there are multiple carousels on the page with a class of post slider. So obviously our jQuery is probably going to select the last one on the page, or it will select all of them, but the most recently selected one is the one that is at the bottom of the page, and it will create an instance for that one only. And whatever you do on all the other carousels, the effects will be taking place on only that bottom carousel. Okay, so this is obviously not a workable solution. We need to fix it, and the point where we need to make this reusable is on the instance itself, because we cannot go on changing the classes of each of the carousels so that they can be unique, and then also duplicating the instance with that new updated class for that new carousel. So if we do that, if we do it that way, we're going to have, for every carousel, we're also going to have a separate class name to that carousel and a separate instance like this one. So what we will do is we will leave as many HTML for carousels as possible on the page, and all of them can have the same class names. We don't really care. It is down here in our JavaScript that we are going to delegate the job of differentiating the various carousels to our jQuery. And the way we do this is using a list. So basically, if you use this jQuery object and select an element, let's say we select any element that has a class of post slider, this will normally return a list of elements. And if you just go ahead and attach .slick here, it will only make sure it provides one of those elements to that .slick method that you're using. But if you use the .each method, then our jQuery is going to make this behave like a loop, and you will be able to execute a function within that loop that is going to perform some operation on each of the items coming from the list. Alright, so this is like a for each loop or a for loop. Okay, so the function within this each method is going to take the index of the current element in the loop, and the element itself, I'm just going to call that element slider, since we are looping over a list of sliders, so each of them will be a slider. So jQuery is going to know how to differentiate each of these sliders in the list without us needing to give those sliders unique class names or unique classes. Alright, so for each of these sliders, we are going to create an instance. I'm going to cut this instance here we're using before, and I will paste it within the function. So now, instead of instantiating the slick on this element with this selector, we're going to be instantiating the current slider in the loop. So we are going to replace this class selector here with the current slider in the loop. Let me just format this a bit. Okay, so here we are creating an instance of Slick Carousel for this particular slider only, not all of them or not the last one. Like I said, jQuery will be able to identify which slider we are currently instantiating. And the arrow buttons too need to be unique. We need to be specific that we are selecting the next arrow and previous arrow for a particular slider. So we are also going to use the current slider for these cases. And here what we will do is we are no longer going to start selecting from the carousel container, because the carousel container is outside of the post slider. Alright, so we are going to, in order to select the next arrow and the previous arrow, we are going to have to begin from the slider itself and work our way to the arrow for that slider. The way we will do this is, let me just comment this out. We'll begin by selecting the slider first, and each of those sliders have buttons that are just a sibling to them. Let me scroll up and show you. Okay, so we have the carousel container. Within that carousel container, we have a post slider, and within the carousel container, we also have the two buttons. So they are in the same level of depth inside the carousel container as the post slider, so you can consider them to be siblings. Okay, so in jQuery there's a function to select such elements. So after selecting the slider, we're going to say find a sibling or siblings of this particular slider that have the following classes, and those classes, let me just reuse this. Those classes include the next arrow and the previous arrow class. Okay, so these are the arrows that are specifically belonging to this slider. So if we go to our home page and reload, and we attempt to scroll now, it's going to, each of the buttons is going to behave consistent with its own particular slider. Okay, so that's it for being able to create multiple carousels on the same page while reusing the same code. So what we need to do now is to create some space between the two sections, and I did assign a class to each of the section elements specifically for that purpose. So we are going to define a CSS for the page section class. So let's go to our public.css, and under the pages section I'm going to define a CSS for page section, and it's going to basically be a margin top of 0, then margin left and right of 0, or auto to centralize horizontally. But since all the items or the sections are 100%, this will simply just be another version of 0. And then at the bottom, that is where we want to create the space. We're going to give each section a margin at the bottom of 64 pixels. So we refresh, and I think we have some good space between each of the sections. That brings us to the end of this video. I will see you in the next one.